Sounds sciencey. How the public is fooled by those who misunderstand and misappropriate science. I might also be able to call this talk scientific. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. So, sciencey. It's the quality of looking and sounding like you are a scientist or doing science. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Who does it, why they do it, and why people are fooled by it. And also maybe there's something we could do about it. Throughout 2010, as part of a master's thesis that I was working on, I studied over 1,000 websites of amateur paranormal investigation groups. Yes, the ghost hunters, the Bigfoot trackers, the UFO chasers. I was attempting to figure out just how popular these groups were across the US, but mainly I wanted to know how they used science in describing their activities, what was their idea of science, and I figured that their ideas about science would represent the general public's ideas about science as well. So that was one of my hypotheses. So here are sciencey things. These are stereotypical depictions of what science looks like. You know, the tools and imagery of science people see in popular culture all the time. This is what the public thinks represents science. It's the stock imagery of science, if you will. So the things that make you say, ooh, this is sciencey stuff. And I suspected that the majority of these paranormal groups would use some sort of science symbolism and jargon in their representations, and it's what writer Susan Hack calls the honorific usage of science, which means they utilize those things about science as an all-purpose term of praise, meaning strong and good. And they did that, but as often happens, you'll find more than you expected when you start looking at things, both good and bad. But what I tell you today probably won't be that surprising, but note that no one had ever done this before. No one had ever counted the number of these types of groups that were available to participate in across the country and never looked at them systematically. We'd all just assumed that ghost hunters and the UFO chasers were all the same, doing silly stuff, wasting their time. But that's an overgeneralization. And as a smart doctor often said, I believe you'll find things are a bit more complicated than that. It's not all bad. Think about when amateurs participate in science. Backyard astronomers, fossil collectors, bird counters, they contribute by giving their data, their interesting data, directly to the scientists. Now, they may have a good idea about what they found, but they don't write up the conclusions. They hand their data off to the experts who do the science thing with that. So it goes through the proper channel. And then that collaboration of experts is what goes on to feed our body of knowledge. But that's not what these amateurs I looked at were doing, not even close. So I defined my unit of study. It was the group, not an individual, it was the group. The Amateur Research and Investigation Group, and I gave them an acronym, ARIG, so I didn't have to keep typing that over and over again. So to define what an ARIG is, they have the following characteristics. They're not under the auspices of any academic institution or run by a working research scientist. Their activities are focused around investigating unexplained events such as hauntings, mystery animal sightings, unidentified aerial object reports, anomalies, and parapsychological phenomena, things that academic science doesn't really look at. They're self-forming, self-perpetuating, but they don't provide a primary means of income for the participants. So you can call it a serious hobby. Serious leisure was one of the concepts that I looked at. I used their websites, which today is the most common way you'd find some of these groups other than by word of mouth. But it's a good way to see their standardized view of what their purpose was and how they presented themselves. So I looked for clues that indicated the outright mention of science or a suggestion of science on their site. Now, when it came to answering how many of these groups there were in the US, I got to about 1,300 and I stopped counting because it was sort of like that, you know, you can never get to all of them. And they were very fluid, you know, so one would go, one would drop out while they would reform under another name. So it was very hard to keep track of which group was active at any one time. But I think there's perhaps thousands more. Out of these 1,000 groups, and what equals 1,000 in this case for the study, I found that over half used the word science or scientific on their website to describe their methods or results. And some even used those words in their group name. Again, that honorific usage of science to make them sound strong and good and reliable. So to condense my thesis into a bottom line, they almost across the board misrepresented and misunderstood the basic procedures, rules, and ethos of science. From what I could tell, they had little idea what it means to do science at all, let alone do science that was any good. And I don't think they could even if they wanted to, but I'm not sure that that's their fault either. In our society, we learn that science is a high bar. It's valued. It has the answers. And people invoke science as a way to legitimize their conclusion. And when real science isn't there to help them do that, they might make some up or cherry pick. So we see that in the climate debates and things like that. So not only are they fooling themselves, but they are fooling the public with their views that they put out there. So when your audience does not really grasp the definition of words like frequency, energy, electromagnetic, and quantum, you can throw them out there with relative immunity and it sounds like you know what you're talking about, because science is supposed to sound like esoteric mumbo jumbo. It's another language. It's scientese. So Eric's and many others have co-opted this language and symbols and sort of the methods of science into their fields. So throughout my examination of these groups, the way they operate, I was searching for the word or words to express the way they used sciencey things. And there wasn't quite the word I was looking for. Each commenter had sort of a different take on it. It was conjuring science, there was science-ish sort of stuff. So there wasn't one word that I could get that described what the idea of being sciencey was about. So I came across this word, scientifical. This was already a word in the Urban Dictionary, and it meant a way to make yourself sound intelligent when you have no idea what you are talking about. This really fit. So I started using it. So being scientifical means hijacking the authority of science to sound credible and believable by misappropriating the terms, methods, and imagery of science. And I like to give some examples of how they did this. Well, a huge component of ghost hunting, for example, is the equipment. Apparently, a scientist must have gadgets. The more, the better. So if you have your equipment and you spread out your cables and you hook up your technology and it looks impressive and it looks objective, and they will tell me they consider it objective measuring. The equipment is measuring something. Science is when you measure something. So you can see how that might impress the client or the audience that they're speaking to, especially when they have pretty lights that blink on and off like this. This bottom one on the bottom left is called a periscope, and it's so pretty. But what you could do is you could take your cell phone and you could put it next to it and the lights go around like this. They also use the word professional in a similar way to the way they use scientific, to express seriousness, to appear credible and reliable. So they wanted to portray the message that they were not kids out to have fun and scare themselves. They are researchers. And some of them were very serious. And I wanted to share a few things I found on their web pages. And I have to admit, I was a little taken aback by the degree of hubris. So those who strongly portrayed a sense of scientificity in their presentation consider their subject, the paranormal, as a vastly uncharted form of science, and therefore unjustly ignored by the scientific community. Ambitious goals they had. These scientific-minded groups, their goals included furthering the science, bringing science and the paranormal together, to help the scientific community embrace the world of the unknown, and to compel the scientific world to action. I don't know. So you can figure out a few things about the people running these groups from these kinds of statements. Obviously, they value science, but also, obviously, they don't have a clue how it works. But they want to do it, and they appear to aspire to do science. And that's a charitable interpretation, which I think is fair. They want to do the right thing. They want to go about things in the best way to get answers that they're satisfied with. So many who participate in these activities are not stupid, they're not crazy, and in no way do they feel they are wasting their time. They have a drive to find out, they want to help people who are experiencing these situations, and they want to do things the right way, but they just don't know how. And maybe they aren't too willing to learn because it can lead to possibly disappointing results like a mundane explanation, or worse, saying, I don't know. I don't know what happened to you. I don't know what happened here. They don't seem to like to do that very much. And actually figuring out a research protocol and setting up a study, that isn't as much fun or practical as spending a weekend at a cool historic place or camping out in the woods or whatever. So what they do instead can be called sham inquiry. And that's the process of working backwards from a conclusion to the evidence, but making it appear like it's a legitimate investigation. And their idea of an investigation is where you go to a location that is already haunted and set up equipment and search for results. That's a quote. I'm not mischaracterizing that. I'm not making that up. But it's clearly a case of the cart before the horse there. They aren't approaching their research with the right questions. What, if anything, happened? Which is the better question. So the scientific method is commonly invoked. And we use scientific methods, they say, and groups that reference the scientific method do it in a generic way, for example, describing it as a procedure for the systematic collection of data through observation and experiment. But what is it about the scientific method? And this was so common, we use scientific methods. What is it about that makes people want to throw those words around? Well, what is the scientific method? Yeah, that's the thing. It's not one thing. It's a generalization in itself. And if you use it 3 times, you can make it your own. So these groups have developed a somewhat standard list of things that they do. They talk to witnesses, they gather historical information, they set up their equipment, they monitor for environmental changes, they stay up all night recording audio and visual stuff. Then they do analysis, and then maybe they write up a blog post, or they'll do a report, or they'll do a reveal to their client. So there's no orthodoxy here. There's no one way to investigate the paranormal, so they all do their own thing, and they all write their own how-to books. And if you read them, you'll find each one of these how-to books, often this one is not, but often they are self-published, and they're available for sale at all the paranormal conventions and on websites. And those are the textbooks they give out to their members when they join. So you'll find sections in these books on what is a ghost, the type of entities, what to look for when ghost hunting, how to use the equipment. And the equipment is from notebooks to dowsing rods to electrostatic generators. They tell you how to use those things. They tell you what to say to ghosts when you find them, because that's really important. And the most curious thing about these books, for someone like me who reads a lot of popular nonfiction science type books, is there's no references. There's no citations. And that looks weird to me because, you know, when you're writing science, you have references because you've built on what others have discovered before. That's not happening here. Another clue that they're sort of inventing these things from whole cloth. So perhaps this whole scientifical concept sounds familiar to some of you in the form of what Richard Feynman once called cargo cult science. Now he describes it like this. In the South Pacific during World War II, natives on an island saw that the runways and equipment the people were doing certain things appeared to result in really great stuff being delivered via vehicles from the sky. Food, supplies, stuff they wanted but didn't have access to. So when the war is over, the visitors leave and the planes don't come anymore. Well, they guess, maybe if we do like the visitors did, the planes will come again. So they put fires along the runways that are still left over. They make a wooden hut, and the guy sits in there with fake headphones made out of, you know, shells or coconuts, and they have bamboo antennas, and he sits in the shack, and they wait for the planes. It looks perfect. They're doing things just right, just like they saw it being done, except the planes don't come. Something essential is missing. So there's no meaning or understanding, and the essence and ethos of science is missing in the cargo cult science, in this sham inquiry. So I directly contacted 30 ARIGs via email to ask exactly what was scientific about them, and 8 responded. And I asked, are any of the group members scientists? Do they have training? Yes, they had extensive training in how to investigate ghosts. But no, they rarely had any academic scientific training. Some were computer scientists, so that they thought that counted. 2 weeks ago, I was at a paranormal conference in Gettysburg with 500, and I like to go to paranormal conferences because I like to see what's going on there, and I write about this a lot. It's an activity that everybody should do. You gotta check your skepticism at the door. I write a column for Huffington Post as well, a blog for Huffington Post, and I talk about this because my audience is the general public, and a lot of these people are interested in this. So I wrote about this conference, and I just stopped being skeptical for these 2 days and just listened. And it was very instructive on how invested these people are emotionally in these activities and beliefs. But anyway, I was in the vendor area, and I asked one of the groups, what is it? I looked at the brochure, and it says we use scientific methods. What is it about your group that is scientific? And what I thought was a junior team member, she answered, and she really struggled with the question. She sort of mumbled stuff about equipment and procedure. And then the head of the group stepped in, seeing that she was struggling with this question, and basically this is the same thing, but she sounded more confident about it. But it was, again, scientifical, not scientific. They were going through the motions, just like these cargo cults, and expecting the results to produce something of value. They missed the part in the scientific endeavor where you set up a good study, you have controls, you try to minimize bias, you know how easy it is to fool yourself and what mistakes can creep in and how to define your terms and purpose. And when I actually asked them about specifics of their scientific method, it was as if they had never been asked these questions before, because I would guess they haven't. So as an aside, I asked her, well, if a group is not scientific, what other approach would there be? And she said, oh, then they're just out to have a good time and have fun, not serious. So again, you see that science, serious. Their answers about what was scientific had little to do with actual science, but everything to do with what they see in pop culture, from TV, movies, comics, literature. And what we see in pop culture are these stereotypes of science, the sciencey things. So these ARIG members were playing scientists. So being serious and methodical with equipment and certain language, to them that was the scientific method, although it was missing all those critical components of good science and scientific integrity. And they saw this from these guys and assumed that they were doing what you were supposed to do, so that's who they followed. Now their goal is to find evidence of paranormal activity. And I just have a problem with that concept. You're looking for evidence for something that you don't know what it is. It doesn't really make any sense to me. I can't ever imagine a scientist would ever say, nope, I don't know what it is, it's paranormal. It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. A better goal might be to get the answer based on good evidence and sound reasoning. And they also miss the important concept of skepticism, because I don't think that makes for good TV. They fail to understand what it means to be fooled by our own senses, and they fool themselves with this fake science. They collect data, but then have no framework to hang it on and make sense out of it. But this is just a TV show, and there wouldn't be a problem if everybody realized it was just entertainment and a TV show. But there are all these ARIG participants who do take this stuff extremely seriously. And I asked another group at that conference if they considered themselves to be scientific, and the guy said no. He says, we're in people's houses, we can't have controls, we can't do experiments, we're just there to help people deal with their situation. So that's a bit iffy, but he was honest with me. He knew what his limitations were, so I thought that was interesting. So that's what I found looking at ARIGs. Now in skeptical circles, there are several who think that those of us who have an affinity for topics of the paranormal, such as ghosts and Bigfoot, are doing work that is less important than those focusing on quackery or the perils of religion. So why is my work important? And there is a term called a Bigfoot skeptic, and I am one of those. Because millions of people, now see, did it crack? There we go. Millions of people, especially kids, watch this stuff on TV every day. They think the ghost hunters are scientists. They think that these finding Bigfoot people howling into the night and telling viewers it's definitely a squatch are using scientific methods. They think walking around with gadgets means doing science, and when people get their ideas about science from TV, that's the problem. In 2012, the world didn't end. There we go. Many scientists and writers spent considerable time debunking myths that the world would end. So think about what ideas were out there in the media at that time. There was a rogue planet headed our way, Nibiru. The Earth's poles, magnetic or rotational, were going to shift, and there would be solar flares that would fry us. So these are all very sciencey ideas, but they were warped into this science fiction. And many people couldn't tell the difference. And some were really scared. And even if you listen to popular astrologers, they call their efforts a science because it's got charts and numbers and it refers to planets and stars. And it's very sciencey. But it's the quintessential pseudoscience if I had to pick just one, but it's still in the public eye and it's still given credence. Now go to the store and go to the health and beauty aisle especially. And what you'll find is that the products have sciencey goodness all over them. You got pictures of molecules, you have lots of vitamins and minerals and unique breakthroughs, and it's pretty much just marketing. Come on, there we go. So, and here's the thing you might not have noticed. There are experts in the scientific method in your neighborhood. Around Halloween, watch your local event calendars to see these paranormal groups giving their presentations on the paranormal and the evidence. And they will often tell you about their scientific methods and their very expensive EMF meters and their sound recorders and their FLIR cameras and ghost boxes. And the media will very willingly contact these experts as part of the press releases that they do around this time, which always happens around Halloween, lots of ghost stories. So people read that stuff, and some believe it's scientific because they call themselves experts. So they must be. And it's not an insignificant influence on the public. Pop culture is a considerable influence in how we think about the world. So the slides are not advancing. It's not that big of a deal. There we go. So can we do anything about this? It's very difficult to counter talk that is scientifical. You have to undo assumptions. A lot of unpacking has to take place. And I tried this exercise, and if you tried it, you'd know that it's hard. So last year, one scientist who had views I would characterize as fringe wrote a piece for his own web journal describing the science behind the spate of mysterious sky noises that were being reported all over the world. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah, I did that already. There we go. There were booms, there was like musical sounds, many of which turned out to be hoaxed and ended up just on YouTube as hoaxed videos, but it was 2012. And some people were worried that those musical sounds were trumpets of the apocalypse, so it did get a lot of attention. And his piece was cringeworthy because it had like just a kernel of truth to it. Like it was sort of sounded sciencey, but based on some actual scientific knowledge, but then that kernel exploded into something completely different. He sugar-coated it, he manipulated it, it glossed over like paranormal or caramel popcorn coated in chocolate and sprinkles so that it no longer resembled a kernel of the original information at all. So I watched on blogs and message boards how people reacted to him, and many thought his work was really impressive. Wow, here's a real scientist with real credentials telling us what it all means, very sciencey too. Tasty stuff, but it was not the best thing for you. His explanations of the sky noises in part was that, quote, the effects of powerful solar flares, the impact of shock waves of solar wind and bursts of electromagnetic radiation are the main causes of acoustical gravity waves. Then he used another explanation for geodynamic activity caused by energy releases from the Earth's core. So he had bases covered top to bottom. And it took me days to work through the piece and figure out what he was referring to and how wrong he was. Now, I have a degree in geosciences, and I found it difficult to work through this. Imagine what it would be like for people who just get their science from National Geographic Channel or from CSI or Big Bang Theory. So is it worth it to counter these arguments? This is the website that I run, Doubtful News, a critical thinking news blog, and the majority of my daily traffic comes via search engines. So people Google for information about Dr. Oz's advice on California poppy, or what the latest weird video or photo they saw on the web. And they end up, through that search, at a skeptical site that contains references and an explanation that is rooted in science and reason, not the mystery and hype that you would get on maybe the Daily Mail or some other tabloid-type newspaper or news site. Now, the mystery and hype is what garners web hits for many paranormal and weird news sites. So I think it's worthwhile to counter these arguments, which is what I do on the site. And so you may be able to reach these people indirectly or directly by trying to do this. And I'd like to hope that some people out there, at least, are interested in the better explanation and not just the mysterious one. So another way to counter these arguments is to ask questions of the scientifical experts. So when the local paranormal group or purveyors of woo come and present at your library or your community center, go. Ask a question while the main audience is still there. Now make it a stumper, but don't be mean. And sometimes playing dumb works great. Like, you don't look like the cynical skeptic. You can be influential to the onlookers who may have the same question but just don't know how to phrase it. So you ask, for example, how do you know that your anomalous EMF measurement is anomalous if you've only measured it one day at one time? Shouldn't you get background samples? Can you explain how the ghost interacts with these electromagnetic fields? And if your local Bigfoot expert or homeopath comes around, it's just as much fun. Prepare some questions before you go, though, so you know what type of questions to ask. Comment on news pieces or write to reporters. I do this quite often. People will see those comments underneath those articles on the web. Again, try not to be nasty, but just be very straightforward. So you can take a scientific approach on these subjects without disparaging the people who are, like I said, emotionally invested in it. But how to do that is a whole other talk and a half. But just a reminder, it can be done. I've had some success in talking to the other side and making new friends out of it. So it can be done. It doesn't have to be confrontational. And going to a non-skeptic conference like a paranormal conference or what the Skeptic Zone podcast calls the Mind, Body, Wallet Festival, just to see what they're like and ask questions, and it is a great exercise. So I'll wrap up with two concepts for you I think about a lot. Maybe, we should all be thinking about them, is outreach and education. So those paranormal investigators and the kids reading books about Bigfoot and UFOs or watching TV shows, people who are impressed by herbal medicines, homeopathy, acupuncture, it sounds impressive. They want the science. The weekend ghost hunters with their measuring gadgets and recording devices want to measure things and analyze and ponder, but they aren't prepared to really get the answers that would be valuable. They have not learned how to do research or experiments or to assess the evidence or be objective. And actually, what I noticed is that after about 10 years of trying these ghost hunters, the scientifical method has failed them. And they have nothing new to show the world about ghosts, and they haven't found Bigfoot. So what they're beginning to do is give up on the sciencey stuff and instead turn towards the spiritual New Age explanations for these types of things. When I went to the conference, there were arrays of every saint's medal you could think of, rosaries, chakras, lucky charms. And they tell you, just arm yourself with all of these things, do prayers, do cleansing so they don't follow you home. All these things, no matter what beliefs you have, protect yourself. So you could see that they're trying to make sense of this, and they're frustrated that science hasn't given them the answers and the way they tried it. And it's no wonder. So they're trying these other frameworks to make sense of it, but they're not going to give up their field because they're emotionally invested in it. Because the serious hobby helps define who they are. And I think the same could be applied to a lot of us in this room. Being skeptically active sort of does define how we define ourselves and who we are. So that population might be lost to science, for the time being at least, but I couldn't help but wonder if real scientists had approached these subjects in a respectful way and addressed their concerns, if that might have changed things. I don't know. And not many scientists want to do that. But many scientists are happy to answer questions and would be willing to help if asked. What I'm sure of is that these people really believe this stuff, and they need to go down a path in order to make their own conclusions. They will not accept just being told they are wrong. They would appreciate if people validated their confusing experiences that they had and assured them there's nothing to worry about. Really, you don't have demons infesting your house. But they want their issues taken seriously. And it might seem funny, and you want to laugh at them, but don't. Like I said, if you ever go to these conferences, you'll see how serious these people are about it. And so being dismissive doesn't work, because things are more complicated than that. So therefore, I don't advocate walking up to the black t-shirt brigade, as we call the paranormal crews, because they're all wearing black t-shirts, and telling them that they're a bunch of idiots for chasing ghosts, because telling them that they're ignorant is no good. So how much of the problem relates to the general public falling for sciencey sounding stuff because they don't have a good basis in scientific education? A few months ago, I interviewed a professor from Penn State who was teaching a class called Science in Our World. It was about science appreciation, and I loved this idea. Science, as it's taught in school, is not done all that well. Kids may be taught some science facts and methods, but are not taught why science is important to our society, what problems it could help solve, what problems it has, and why science is one of the best ideas humans ever came up with. So kids in school learn how caterpillars turn into butterflies and how to mix baking soda and vinegar, and they say, oh, that's cool. But that really didn't teach them much of anything. They're not going to go on and work as scientists, most of them. So they forget what they learned, and they don't think much of science anymore because they don't think it's relevant to their daily lives. So this professor was teaching his students, freshmen, non-science majors, how to evaluate scientific findings in their everyday life. So he showed them that modern science is not found in textbooks. It's not the work of the lone genius that yells eureka. It's not laser beams, it's not proton packs. It's a really useful process. It's an interactive community. It's an ever-changing body of knowledge. And it's a great set of guidelines to help you understand things that maybe these kids are interested in, like health, diet claims, sex and relationships, how to take care of your pet, what to think about that claim that your dorm is haunted. And it was very much about thinking critically and evaluating evidence. And this type of breadth understanding, as opposed to depth, which you get these courses in college, breadth and depth, I think that needs to happen earlier than the college level. That might be too late, because the teacher said they're already steeped in these strange beliefs like conspiracy theories and alt-med and hauntings, of course. So they need to be inoculated to recognize shonky science much sooner. And you can do this with younger kids. I have spoken to younger kids about monsters and ghosts and end of the world stuff, and they are really interested in that. To them it's relative, and to them it's things that they think about, so you can apply that to their real lives, and they can learn to be skeptical pretty early. So the good news is I don't think people are closed to science. They just never learned how to use it or respect it in the correct way. And I think the fact that they're drawn to sciencey things is evidence for respect for science by a large part of the population. So I'm trying to change my approach to work with that, and I hope I can adopt an attitude of trying to provide a more helpful suggestion so that inquiry will deliver a better answer rather than just attacking the fringe fields with the anti-woo hammer. I'm trying to go a different route. And I'm okay with validating their experience of the paranormal and fear of the unknown, because that's their interpretation. I can't change their interpretation. But maybe I can have a chat with them, exchange ideas non-confrontationally. Maybe someday maybe I can introduce them to a different path where they can go down and discover things on their own. So if you want to learn more about Sound Sciencey, I write a web column by that name, and I do the Doubtful News site. It has examples every day of how the media and our cultural beliefs distort the news. And so now that I talked about sounding sciencey, I bet you'll see it everywhere. So thank you.